what it actually is from a theoretical standpoint. Jump straight in. What is a thin value bet? And when should we?
Yeah, the idea behind a value bet is when we bet typically on the river. When we bet on earlier streets, we might have the best hand, but the hand isn't over. But by the time we get to the river and we're trying to decide whether we want to bet or not, a value bet is generally what we consider to be we're betting because we believe we have the best hand, and we want to get more value for it. We want to make the pot bigger. So most people, when they get to the river, they have an idea of whether they have the best hand or not. And if they have the best hand, they go ahead and bet. Now, there's two winkles you have to be careful about. First of all, for your hand to be a good value bet, it's not just the case you think you have the best hand. It's you think you have the best hand if you bet and get called. And that's an important distinction, because sometimes you will get to the river and you'll be pretty sure you have the best hand, but if you bet, your opponent's going to fold all worse hands and only call with better hands. So that's not a value bet, even though you have the best hand. The second winkle is a lot of people will bet when they're pretty sure they have the best hand, and they're pretty sure it'll be the best hand even if they bet and get called. But for a hand to make a good, profitable, thin value bet, it only has to be good more than half the time. Because if you bet whatever amount you bet, X, on the river, and your opponent puts in X, that extra 2X has gone into the pot. If you win that 2X more than half the time, having only invested X, you're showing a profit. So you don't need your hand to be absolutely the best or even mostly the best. It just has to be the best hand when called more than half the time, for it to be good value bet. And the closer we get to it being only slightly more than half, the thinner the value bet. If we bet a hand that's good all the time, the nuts, we know we're winning. If we bet a hand that's say good 80% of the time when we bet and get called, that's not thin either, because we're mostly winning when we bet. It's when we bet when our hand is only going to win 51 or 52% of the time. That's a thin value bet. And a big difference between very good players and, let's say, mediocre players is they find these thin value bets. They find that extra value on the river by making these very thin value bets.
I must admit, I'm one of the mediocre players a lot of the time. I sometimes consider myself a poker genius when I make a thin value bet, but if I'm honest, a lot of the time it's because the person involved is a complete call-in station. So that's obviously the threshold for what makes a value bet goes up considerably. Then it's not necessarily theoretically correct.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a specific example now of a hand. We'll take 40 big blinds, folds to the button. The button raises. The button's raising this fairly wide range, slightly over half hands, and the big blind elects to just call. And the flop comes ace, 8, 2, rainbow. So this is obviously not a good flop for the big blind, so they'll be checking 100% of the time. And the button, this is such a good flop for them, irrespective of what their hand, they're going to go ahead and throw out a small bet. And let's say the big blind calls. So when they call, we kind of remove the top of their range.
Yep.
The strongest ace X, and we remove the hands they would bluff with, and we remove the hands that just aren't strong enough to continue, like Jack 6 suited. So now they have something. And then let's say the turn is 4 of spades, and they check to us again. Now, they might have some leads, but in this case, they're going to check. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to keep betting with our very strong hands and some bluffs. But we're going to do a lot of checking as well. Like if we have a hand like kings or queens, it doesn't make a lot of sense to bet now. If we bet a second time, we're probably folding out everything that isn't an ace, and we're not folding out an ace. So it makes sense to have a very wide checking range now. So let's say we do check, and the river comes a queen of hearts, and the big blind checks to us. Now, before we look at what the button is supposed to bet, I'm going to ask you, Barry, if you've got into this spot, what hands are you going to now go ahead and bet for value on the river?
Most of my ace X, pocket kings, possibly some queen X, and to be perfectly honest, I would stop at the strongest queens a lot of the time. Caveat unless my opponent is a calling station.
Okay, so let's have a look at what the button is supposed to do, facing a check. So facing a check, you go ahead and you bet all of your ace-x. I mean, I think that's a no-brainer. Most people would find that. You just have to assume you have the best hand. If your opponent had an ace, which they check called, after the turn goes check, check, there's a very strong chance they would lead the river. So we just have to assume if we have an ace, we have the best hand and we go for value. If we have a queen, we're going to want to mostly bet as well. We're going to want to bet. We can even bet hands as weak as tens.
Mm.
Now, it comes down to what we think our opponent is going to call with. And this is always a useful exercise. When you get to the river and you're in this final node and your opponent is checked, ask them all the hands they could possibly have. And if you bet, what hands will call. So the solver here is using a couple of different sizes. It's using 59% and 82% primarily. With the 59%, it's betting sets, two pairs, top pair, a lot of second pair. So,
Yeah.
so the Queen X is mostly being bet at this size. And even some third pair. And that's because if we look at what our opponent's going to call with, these are all the hands our opponents call. They're going to call all the top pair, second pair, but they're going to call a lot of third pair as well. So when we have second pair, we're beating all that third pair and we're beating their lower pairs. They're even supposed to do a small amount of calling with king high. Because remember, we're not just value betting when we bet. We'll be bluffing some of the time as well. So they will have hands which lose to all our value but beat all our bluffs. Like king high. So they have to call with all of those. Or sorry, they have to call with some of those, bluff catch. So when you add in the other hands that they're calling because they might actually be the best, they're calling with third pair because it might be the best hand. They're calling with second pair. That means that, you know, if we consider, for example, how much does second pair? If we bet a queen, well, we're losing to top pair, we're losing to some of the second pair. That means we're actually beating 90% of the hands now that are calling us. Third pair, low pairs, and they're bluff catchers. So it's not even that thin betting a queen. Betting something like tens is thinner because we're obviously losing to all of the top pair, all of the second pair, some of the third pair as well. But we're still crucially over the 50% threshold. And that's what makes it a good thin value bet. We're winning more than half the time when called.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why people are averse to thin value betting with say pocket tens is fear of being check raised bluffed.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Players just kind of they want that feeling of relief. They check behind, they win the pot, and they don't want to get check raised bluff. But in the long term, that's a leak because if you think about all of the times when you could have bet and got called, you've lost that extra money, and that all adds up over the long run. And yes, sometimes if you're playing against good, strong opponents, they will check raise you as bluffs, and you will fold the best hand some of the time, having put more money in. But in the long run, you'll make more money from all the thin value bets that worked that just got called. It's a tricky spot, and people often try to avoid tricky spots when they get check raised. Like if we look at what the response here to the bet is, when we bet. So when we bet, say 59%, they're supposed to do some shoving, and you know, some of the time they're bluffing.
It's mostly like 2x and 4x, which I guess it's because there's no straights to block or flushes to block, so it's because they block sets, right?
Well, they're blocking when there's no straights or flushes, just blocking pairs is good, or sets as you put it, two pairs, etc. And yeah, so and obviously if they do move all in, we're going to have to fold a lot of hands that are losing to all their bluffs. But we have other hands in our range that are happy they bluffed. We're perfectly happy to snap them off with queens. Or aces, or two pairs, etc., etc. So don't allow that fear of getting check raised to cause you to miss value. In the long run, you want to be going for thin value as much as possible. And every time you do decide to check back and you win and your opponent shows over a hand that's slightly worse than yours, your reaction shouldn't be, oh, great, I won the pot. Your reaction should be, crap, I missed a thin value bet.
Yeah.
But the key to it is to break down the opponent's range and think about all the hands they can call. And remember, you only have to beat half of them. And that depends on size as well. Like when we get to the river, if we use a bigger size, say 82% a pot, now they're not going to call third pair to as much. They're going to start folding third pair, and they're going to fold all their low pairs, a lot of their low pairs and king highs. So suddenly now the threshold for our bet becomes higher. Now we're kind of only betting top pair plus for value at that size, because that's what's beating half the range.
I guess as well. I mean, I think some people might say, I don't want to bet with pocket tens here because I don't think a pair of fours is going to call. But that in itself is probably a good thing, right? If people are overfolding, then our bluffs are printing value, and that's the way to think about it.
Yeah. Sometimes, no, students often bring that up. They say, well, they're not going to call worse hands. And if you really believe that to be true, then start bluffing like crazy in rivers. That would be very profitable. The solver is saying they have to call all these hands. If they diverge from that and they call less hands and they start folding more, then they become exploitable to bluffs, and you should be bluffing a lot more.
And as we wrap this video up, Dara, like I'll call out what I think is a leak of mine, or it might be a smart exploit. I'll let you decide. I do find some thin value bets, dependent on the situation and dependent on the opponent. I have a tendency to make, say, the pocket tens bet in this situation. I have a tendency to telegraph my bet sizing and make it quite a small bet because I rationalize to myself that a four isn't going to call anything other than a small bet. Is that a good strategy, or am I leaving myself open to too much exploitation?
It's a good strategy against weak exploitable players. Yeah. Weak exploitable players will often they just have a sort of a value amount in their head that they'll call with different hands, and they don't think about their overall range. Another point I want to make on thin value bets is, as you know, like the more value bets we have, the more bluffs we get to have, because our bluffs are balancing our value. So if we're not finding thin value bets, our value range is smaller than it should be, and therefore we can't do as much bluffing as we should be doing. And a lot of players who don't find thin value bets but do find all the bluffs are actually weighted towards over bluffing as a result. So if you're playing against somebody and you think they're not capable of thin value betting, but they seem to be betting rivers at a fairly high frequency, there's a very good chance they're over bluffing, and you should start calling all your bluff catchers down against that type of player.
Yeah, we actually, now that you mentioned that, I do remember we actually covered that in our most recent book, Beyond GTO, and I was very surprised that we actually called out the exploit the leak as not thin value betting enough, and I was very surprised that the exploit against those players is to call more. My instinct, my first order thinking instinct was that if somebody doesn't thin value bet, then that means they're weighted towards very strong hands. But as you said, they're like too polarized, too bluff heavy.
Yeah, they're still likely finding all the bluffs, but they're just not finding enough value bets. And you know, you can always think of those as two sides of a scales. And if you pull some thin value bets off the value type of the side of the scales, but you don't pull off any of the bluffs, then suddenly you become lopsided towards bluffs.